What's good, everyone? My name is Jacob Moses. I'm the community builder here at Strong Towns. And thank you for joining us for another round of our Ask Me Anything series. This is a weekly webinar series we've been knocking out every Thursday, 1 p.m. Eastern Time, where we answer your most pressing questions about your community and the steps it can take to become a stronger place. We have a ton of great questions to knock out today, inspired by a presentation that we had this past Tuesday with Joe Minicozy. He's the principal at Urban 3, discussing economic developments and specifically how you can identify and invest in the most financially productive areas within your community. If you happen to miss that presentation, all is well. This afternoon, we're going to be uploading that to the community site, so you can go back and refer to it as needed. Joining us today, of course, we have Joe Minicozy, principal at Urban 3, and Strongtown's president and founder, Chuck Marone. Joe and Chuck, how y'all doing today?
Great.
Hey, thanks, Jacob.
So happy to have y'all here. This is going to be fun. So folk joining us live, we have about a dozen pre-submitted questions that we're going to knock out throughout this webinar. But if you're joining us live throughout the webinar, we also encourage you to share your own questions. If you hover over the Zoom window at the bottom of it, you'll see a box that says Q&A. Click that bad boy, ask your question. That will show up on our feed. And throughout the webinar, we will try our best to knock out some of these live questions as well. Chuck and Joe, let's make this happen. I got the first question here on deck. Michael asks, there's a widely held belief or myth that growing the grand list in a town or city will result in lower property taxes for all homeowners. Is there any scientific or academic information to support this belief? And this term, grand list, was new to the three of us. So we looked it up, and it means essentially the portfolio of properties that are within a community. So Joe, I'll pitch this to you first. Is it appropriate for just a city to focus on growing the number of properties within their portfolio without maybe considering the public infrastructure costs to actually serve those different properties? Is there information that shows that it's enough just to add to that list without considering perhaps the costs as well?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways that I would address that. Well, first of all, not all properties are created equal. That there are different levels of cost on those properties, different levels of revenues. So at the very least, you need to understand what's good and what's bad, what's healthy growth and what's not healthy growth. So, but adding property taxes into a system that's confined, yeah, you're going to be adding more money into something that hasn't changed. But if you stretch that system out to get more taxes and you're essentially upside down, that's the proverbial Ponzi scheme of growth, that it's all seen as an opportunity, but it's really not a long-term positive advantage.
Let me add one thing that I see kind of as the epitome of this mindset. I can't tell you how many small towns I've worked for where they've had sewer and water and road all sitting there in the empty lot, and the storage shed people come in and say, "Hey, we're gonna put in storage sheds here," and the city says, "Well, something is better than nothing." And I've always stepped back and said, "Look, the storage sheds aren't employing anyone. They're not using any sewer. They're not using any water. You've put thousands of dollars of utilities to this site, and you're getting what? Storage units? Like this doesn't make any sense." And, so the idea of just growth for the sake of growth, any business can sell their products at below cost and do really well if the idea is just to do transactions. But if you're actually trying to endure, to be around tomorrow, to still be a business, you got to have profitable investments, and cities are no different.
And to build off Chuck's comment, I mean, think of it as a 2-drink minimum. What's the minimum amount of growth that we need to have to maintain that infrastructure that we've just put out to that property? Mm. And if you're not covering that cost, that's a subsidy. So if you're giving that subsidy indirectly because you're letting somebody underbuild in that environment, that's a subsidy. So make sure that you're aware that you're losing money in that situation.
Let's dig deeper into this concept of subsidies. Got a great question from Julian. She asks, if a local government is basically subsidizing suburban infrastructure, what would be the solution, assuming that the city already has this infrastructure and can't just take it away? So they've already built all these roads, built all these pipes, and we know that that's a sunk cost. We can't recoup that in any way. What are some solutions? Would you recommend increasing property taxes for those residents? Do we establish growth boundaries? Joe, perhaps from your work, all the great work you've done with different communities, creating these value per acre analyses, helping people think about the cost of the infrastructure that they build, do any particular solutions come to mind, or shifts in maybe their mindset to start to make better use of the stuff that they've already built?
I mean, these are inherently human problems. And it's I'm just going to give a little plug to the CNU in June. Chuck and I are doing a talk on the psychology of our work, but also the psychology of decision-making processes. And we're up essentially against human decision processes. So you can't just roll into the room and just say, you're subsidized, you're subsidized, you're subsidized, you're subsidized. I mean, it's just, we have a tendency, particularly as planners, to kind of put that out there and talk about carbon change or climate change and carbon loading, and sprawl is costly. But you're essentially judging somebody at that point, and that person was making a rational choice based on the economic situation that they were in. So to go in there and just shame them isn't gonna win you any friends, first of all.
Sure.
So the part of this is just getting people aware to the cost. So our attitude, and we call, I call the term geo accounting, is that we're going to put that number on a map for you so you could see it, and just be aware of where you are financially, give you the picture. The same way that if you go into your doctor is going to start with some basic elements of measurement. What's your body mass index? What's your height? What's your weight? Stuff like that. And then, hey, what's your cholesterol? So let's go through some measurements and start to see where you are in this. Now we have to start making changes based on that data. So it's starting with the point of data and information and education and making people literate about this stuff so you can start to make effective change. But if you're just ignoring, I mean, I hate to say this, and this is going to be part of my next talk in 2 weeks. We're seeing this with COVID. We don't have accurate data. We don't have accurate measurements. We don't know who's really infected. If you don't have information, it's really hard to make a decision. And so this is something that I'm hoping that as we all go through this pandemic, we're learning the importance of data and information to be conscious about making the right choices. And so this is what we're trying to, that's our ethos, and what I believe Strong Towns ethos is starting from a point of information.
I'm also going to follow up and just say, I'm going to key in on one word, maybe unfairly, but the word was, what's the solution? And I think ultimately there's a little bit of reckoning here. If we've made a lot of bad investments, sometimes the solution is that you're going to take a loss on those investments. Like you're going to literally have to walk away from some of this stuff. As difficult as that sounds, and as hard as that is to get our mind wrapped around, we have stretched our cities way too thin. And some of this stuff, when that cul-de-sac goes bad, we're just not going to have the money to fix it. When that pipe goes rotten, we're just not have the money to repair it. And I think we need to get ready mentally for that transition, because what you see now going on in Washington, D.C. and in our state capitals is this rush to kind of prop everything back up again. And like, let's what's the movie Weekend at Bernie's? Like, let's Weekend at Bernie's this whole economy. And what we actually need to do is just come to grips with the fact that we made some really dumb decisions, not point fingers like Joe said, but then actually like step back and say, okay, now what do we do? Like, how do we make the best of this? And I think a lot of those, a lot of those areas we're just going to walk away from, and rightfully so. They were bad ideas.
Joe, anytime someone sees your presentations or encounters these great value per acre analyses that we have on the Strong Towns site, we always get the same question. That is, how can I make this happen in my own community? They're really inspired by your work. They also have that sense of, that they've identified a productive place in their community. They know it's generating the most tax revenue, but want to be able to put together the compelling analysis to share with their peers. I have a question from Marion that's going to dig a little deeper into that. Marion asks, I just finished the Economics of Development 101 presentation, and I was wondering if there are pointers or high-level directions in how to start evaluating our local situation in regards to taxation, infrastructure costs versus debt, to see what behavior we are encouraging and what we may need to look at. If someone is inspired by your work, Joe, and wants to, maybe do a DIY approach, try their own hand, at creating one of these analysis. Any particular place that you would recommend that they start?
Well, I'd start by reading a chapter in Chuck's book. I mean, Chuck basically talks about this with the Taco Johns. That basically happened. We were on a panel together in 2010 at the CNU in Madison. I'd never met Chuck. I only saw some of his stuff on the internet. And he asked me that same question. And we just basically walked through, I call it a pick and poke, which is basically just poking around inside the assessor's files of just opening up your, everybody, generally speaking, everybody at the end of this, this video, your county generally has all of the assessor's files online. What we do is we suck all that information in and we geoprocess it through GIS. You don't need to do that. I would just pick a couple properties, just be curious and just grab your Walmart or your mall, and you can click on the property and it'll tell you the taxable value right on the parcel. Usually you can go into the assessor's tax rolls as well and see what they pay in taxes. There's an amazing amount of information online, but usually it'll say the area, the value, the size of the parcel. And you just divide the taxable value into the acres to normalize it. And that creates an apples to apples analysis of any property type because you're normalizing over its density. That's the easiest way to do it. As far as when you get into the costing, the way that we do costing is pretty intensive. We get all of the data from the cities. We get their linear feet of pipe and all of that. There are some normalizations that are done that are generalized costs. Rutgers University published one in 2000 called The Cost of Sprawl, the year 2000. And there's some basically generalized suburban versus urban rough costs. That's the simplest way. Smart Growth America actually has a table that they use on theirs as well. And again, you're gonna probably be met with resistance, where it's like, oh, those are generalized numbers, those don't work here. Well, then that usually begs the question of, well, do you know what they are to that individual that's giving you that feedback? And I think that's the thing that what I've seen as the Strong Towns movement is it's really challenging to move past the histrionic arguments or the things that I believe in or whatever. And it's moving into, okay, well, if this is data and this is evidence, do you have an evidence-based argument against this?
Sure.
Otherwise, this is the only information we have. Just don't get into a trap of you're bringing data to the table and somebody's going to argue with you at an emotional level.
Sure. And listeners, if you're curious about seeing what one of those tutorials actually look like, our colleague Daniel Herges put together a fantastic tutorial on the Strongtown site. Don't know the URL top of mind, but if you just Google Strongtown's value per acre tutorial, you'll see a great step-by-step guide there as well to complement some of these great tips from Joe. We got a live question. Let's see, from Steven. Steven, what's going on? He asks, Chuck has proposed a ratio of private to public investment that's between 20 and 40 to 1. Joe, does Urban 3's data support that ratio as a good metric? Do y'all use a similar metric in your work?
We don't use that metric, but it is a good metric. We support it. I think a lot of what we're trying to do is just get people into a data habit and start to look at the information and start to measure stuff. What's the amount of pipe that you have? What's the ratio of cost on that pipe system, and is it paying itself off? But ultimately, that's going to get to a number that the reader just mentioned here. There are cities that can handle a little bit of debt, handle that stretching because they're growing. Interestingly enough, I was in Guelph, Canada, super awesome place. They have a growth boundary. And I just made a flippant comment about how cities don't have reserve accounts. A lot of cities that we work with don't have any reserve account, which is the basis of this is a load that you're carrying that you just don't see. And this is, back to the story about Lafayette, Louisiana, that, that roads and pipes are assets and not liabilities, but they are liabilities. Canadians are awesome. The finance officer, raised her hand as soon as I mentioned that cities don't have reserves. And she's like, oh, we have a healthy reserve. In fact, we've got a growth fund. And I was like, wait, what? you have a growth fund? And she goes, but of course, that eventually we're going to grow beyond our boundary. We need to have reserves set up there so that we can use that to leverage our growth and grow properly. I was like, what? This is awesome. And it's just, think about that. It's like, I have a reserve account built in my business. I can handle what we're going through with COVID right now. My world has changed just like everybody else's, but I had to build that reserve so that I could make it through this time, or we could make it through this time. Now, ideally, I'm going to also set up reserves to grow my business as well. I can't just go out and get a bank loan and start hiring staff. I could if I wanted to, or maybe go to a Silicon Valley hedge fund investor and have them throw a bunch of money at me. But ultimately, I have to pay them back, right? So it's not, taking in revenues isn't going to get me anywhere unless I can actually cover that cost. Cities are just really big versions of that business. So having a ratio, putting the ratios out there, at least begs the question, are we hitting something? Have we even asked this question? And I think that's the most powerful thing about that ratio.
I was just going to add, and I appreciate everything that Joe just said. I think he's right. And I'm pretty sure that I say in the book that this is like our best estimation of what this should be. I'm getting a note that my connection's unstable. Are you still hearing me, Jacob, just fine?
I still hear you fine. A little choppy,
okay,
but I hear you for the most part.
So I do think that if we take a snapshot of where cities were back in the pre-depression era, I think the 20-to-1, 40-to-1 ratio is exactly what we see measured. And Joe and I, as we're going through these books in the basement of the Harvard, planning school, we're seeing these old town books that are looking at things exactly like this. How much private wealth do you have? How much public, investment have you made? What are those ratios? I do think that there is a strong case to be made that modern construction techniques, modern polyethylene pipe, modern, road construction techniques, these things have made us, in a sense, like more efficient. They've made these processes a little bit cheaper per foot to build and a little bit more resilient in terms of how long they'll last. And so there is an argument to be made that those ratios maybe would be a little bit lower given that context. It's really hard to discern that though, because when you look at like individual neighborhoods, you can see kind of where they're at. But when you look at the cities as a whole, as an aggregate, I mean, let's say it's not 20-to-1, it's 15-to-1 or even 10-to-1. Okay. Lafayette, Louisiana is 1 to 0.5. So, I mean, that's a 30 times increase to get to 15-to-1. We're not even close. And so I think the answer, that Joe gave at the very end there is like, it is really less of a hard and fast metric than it is something to get us thinking about or looking at. Like, we actually have to have private wealth in order to sustain these public promises. When you're way out of whack, when you've got $2 of public investment for every $1 of private investment you've created, you're a train wreck. And that's where a lot of our cities are at today.
Chuck, it reminds me of the city of Fate, Texas. This is an example of a community that has embraced this metric and actually started looking at the data before approving particular developments to ensure there is enough private wealth being generated to cover any of the associated public costs. Is that correct? We've actually seen this metric applied in places like
Fate, Texas. Yeah, Fate, Texas put it as part of their approval process that you have to meet a minimum threshold of 20-to-1. Obviously, I think that that's a good start. And I think that they're really working hard in what is a difficult, third ring exurban kind of place to do something that will make their city endure a little more. There's a lot of, I think, lessons to take from Fate. It's a little bit harder though to apply this stuff in greenfield development, where you're starting with nothing and then you're going out and you're putting in 20-to-1. That's wonderful. But if you turn around and look at the rest of your community and it is 1-to-1 or less, 20-to-1 in one place is good. It's better than what you were doing, but you've got to make up for all the unproductive stuff you've got everywhere else. And that's almost like a 5-alarm fire kind of emergency.
Let's knock out another pre-submitted question. Got a question from Ken. Ken asks, how would the value per acre analysis work in cities that don't collect property taxes? This gentleman happens to live in Oklahoma, where cities rely heavily on sales tax as their main revenue source. It's a bit odd, but it has created a situation where towns don't really care in a meaningful way about property values.
How's that working out for you the last couple of weeks? You know,
I'd
I
love
mean,
to
this is something Joe and I have talked about a lot. Is
Yeah.
like you if you're a sales tax place, when times are good, things are good. When times are bad, yeah, no kidding, it's bad. So
Sure.
go ahead, Joe.
Why would you bother? I mean, it's just Oklahoma, you and Arkansas, y'all need to get in a room together and have a little chat, because it's not working out for either of you. And we saw this in the recession. I mean, you know, it's kind of funny. I think Chuck and I were having a chat a couple of weeks ago, and we're just like, well, it's starting to feel the same all over again. In the recession, the same deal. It's like all of a sudden, all these cities were broke. They're like, oh my God, we're broke. And that's when we started talking this way of like, have you looked at your books? Do you understand this stuff? Do you understand why you're broke? And we were addicted at that point to a pattern. And it was just like, oh, I need my drink. I need my monkey, you know? Retail taxes are just a non-starter for running your city. It's like, why would you do that? There's one of my favorite quotes or terms in planning school was the logical rational nexus. And to make any zoning policy, there has to be a logical rational nexus. So if I know that putting a dumpster in my front yard is going to affect my neighbor's property across the street because I've just put this stupid thing in my yard that no one wants to look at, there's a logical rational nexus to make a planning law that said you should at least screen it so no one can see it from across the street because I'm affecting somebody else's property. So let's think through the logical rational nexus of why would you run a city off retail transactions? What's the logic behind that? Why would you do that? What's the connection between me going out and buying, a chair or a car and being able to run my city off that taxation? Where's the connection? But at least with property tax, I can see the physical connection because you're the property that's within the city. Mm-hmm. So it's just, we have to think that through. And when you're in this collapse, like we're going through right now, keep it up, Oklahoma. You're going to be in this situation where you can't afford the things that you're sitting on. And so what you end up doing is you start making draconian cuts, or worse, you just stop providing services. This is the first thing that we see. There's a lot more places bankrupt than what we feel or see or read about in the newspaper. After the recession, I think it was 2014, I was in Pennsylvania, and I was talking to the state's economic development director, and he said to me, he goes, do you realize we have 230 cities that are currently bankrupt right now? You don't read about them because we're a commonwealth and the state steps in and takes over their budget. So it's, and Chuck's talked about this at length, the fiscal insolvency of where cities are. They're operating insolvently. They're essentially bankrupt. They're just not filed for it. So your parks aren't maintained and everything else. But also back to Oklahoma for a second. You still charge county taxes. The county's still getting property taxes. We're doing a project in Thomasville, Georgia. They charge no taxes at a city level because they get their taxes out of an electric utility, which is a little weird, but that's what they do. But the county's still getting property taxes, and in a ratio of what the downtown produces to the county is an area to value return. It's a 1 to 200 ratio of productivity, their downtown to their county. So the county should be all over helping downtown get revitalized and fixed up and pay for a sidewalk, because they're going to see that value capture in a much higher level. 1 to 200, your dollar in and 200 out, that's really good from a potency standpoint. So I think, it's not to just discount it or just not pay attention to it, but also I'm pretty sure I did run the retail tax models in that last presentation, and I showed Minneapolis, but I could show you Durango, Colorado is a great example. Colorado, the cities get the majority of the retail taxes. The counties get the majority of the property taxes. We did a couple, like a bookstore and a coffee shop. It pays 15 times the property taxes per acre than the Walmart does, and about 5 times the property taxes, 15 times the retail taxes. So again, I would ask, okay, are you measuring it? Can you look at the retail tax data? In North Carolina, it's illegal for us to look at retail tax data, which is unbelievably insane. So maybe the first thing to ask is that for the individual that asked the question is start by asking, can I look at the retail tax data? Go to the city and ask, can I put it on a map? And then they'll tell you whether or not, in a lot of cases, it's confidential. In Arkansas, you couldn't really get it. It's like, or it's missing where it's coming from. A lot of times people don't even look at the data, and it's kind of mind blowing to us. But we run into this all over.
I was going to say, talk about that, the experience you have when you sit down with someone who's never really thought this through, and you have them think about what the return on the road or on that pipe to that residential neighborhood, and they start to realize that they're losing money on every house they put in. The only value that our residents have is as consumers, which is completely at what you've done is you've created a system where what's good for the city and what's good for the individual, or what's good for the community and what's good for the individual, are at odds with each other. And it's like the house divided against itself.
I would also add to this that when policy is made at a point in time in an economic position that you're in at the time that you make that policy, right? So you're making a choice. This is how we're going to run our tax system or our municipality based on how we are today in 1965. Isn't this awesome? Now, if you just do it on retail transactions, that's super awesome when somebody goes and buys a car, if they can afford a car. So what you see when it happens, like in the recession, or now with like all of a sudden there's like Ford's trying to sell me a truck and they'll just drive it to my house. It's like, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not going to buy a truck. It's like no one's going out buying cars all of a sudden. Well, if you're waiting for that retail tax dollar to come off that truck, you're not getting anything. That's probably not going to happen for the next 5 years at least, that people are going to have to deal with what we're all going through. And then there's going to be a recovery time before somebody goes out and buys another vehicle. I'm not going to buy another TV. I'm not going to buy another computer. All of the big ticket items that when we wrote that retail sales tax policy of living off that nice gravy that we pull off the top of that, that's gone. And that's the economic cycle of how this stuff operates. But retail tends to be a much more crazy kind of cycle.
Volatile.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hopefully you haven't taken on a lot of debt with the promise of your retail taxes paying it, because those are the places that will crater first. The debt markets are not going to be kind. There's not going to be any forbearance on your municipal debt, because your pension fund is funded by that debt. It's a whole circle. And, you don't pay your landlord 1 month, there's a little bit of discomfort and everyone's going to have to figure that out. You don't pay US Bank your mortgage 1 month, maybe the federal government will step in and shame US Bank into letting you get by. You don't pay your debt payment, quarterly as a municipality, and they foreclose on you. I mean, they're going to come down on you hard, and they don't really have an option, because your debt as a municipality is not like owned by, grandma up the street who you can negotiate with. She might own a little bit, but it's owned by hundreds of different pension funds and corporations and foreign banks and emerging market people holding it as, AAA type of securities. And, these are not people you can negotiate with, because you can't even identify them to negotiate with. They want their money and they need it. And so, yeah, I hope Oklahoma cities have not, I've dealt with this in Oklahoma City. They're doing lots of wonderful things, but they had this annual bond or semi-annual bond they would take on to do all the big wish list projects every year. And it was their big, look at this. And I'm like, well, where is this money coming from? Oh, we're having all this growth and it's sales tax revenue. And it's going to be a lot. It breaks my heart. It's going to be very, very painful for a lot of these places that have made themselves, through a lot of hubris, really, made themselves incredibly fragile, and that's being exposed right now.
Yeah. Joe, let's talk a little bit about zoning. Whenever we look at your value per acre analyses and see that huge contrast between the downtown, wildly productive financially, going out to the edge of town where we see that productivity just drop, we know a big reason for that is not only because we've expanded horizontally, but because also zoning codes often, lock these neighborhoods under glass. They're not able to adapt and evolve and react to different changes within the community. I got a question from Karen in relation to this. She asks, since where and how we build is largely regulated by zoning, what do you think are some of the next small changes we should make to zoning to rebuild American prosperity? So what are some small steps that we can take today when we revisit our zoning code to help change that graph a little bit, to get some more financial productivity in some of these existing neighborhoods on the edge of town?
Get rid of parking requirements, get rid of lot minimums, allow for, as Chuck advocates, the ability for somebody to move up and incrementally grow in that process, that there should be an easier path to change your parcel and to thicken up a little bit. If the planning staff is resisting that, then the planning staff should be bringing information to the table about what the cost is of servicing those properties based on the zoning that's locked into. That we inside planning need to be as literate about this stuff if we're going to be the ones that are the gatekeepers on the system. That we've got to bring our A game to the system as well. We can't claim ignorance, or this isn't part of planning the way that I learned it. I effectively went to architecture school for both undergraduate and graduate. So I didn't learn any of this stuff in school. So we have to adapt and learn about what we're actually doing, that zoning isn't a panacea for everything. One of the most mind-blowing things that Chuck said that I absolutely love is when he shows the Main Street and says, how thick was their zoning code when they built this? Or let me just get a little bit off screen here. This is Campo de Fiore in Rome. Like, how thick was their zoning code when they built this in 10 AD? It's like these are 7-story buildings back here built without elevators. How are these people surviving for thousands of years? It's my God, they have open food in a square and the food disappears every day. How do they pull this off? I think that's the thing. When we see zoning, we have to realize it's a modern invention. There are some great things about zoning, but there's a lot of stuff that's just detritus that's built up over time that's unnecessary. Let's all accept the fact that minimum lot standards were essentially class warfare. It was designing how I could keep poor people out of my neighborhood. You had to be able to be a big enough landowner to be hanging out with me. Like that's pretty disgusting. A lot of it was racism. So let's understand redlining, this 80-year effect that some neighborhoods are still trapped in amber financially because of these mechanisms that were put in place from policy, and zoning rode along right with it. But parking standards are kind of ridiculous. Why would you require that? We're all born with feet. Marion County, Indiana has 50% of the entire county has 1 car or less per household. That's countywide. So if half your population has 1 car or less, why would you require 2 per parcel, per unit? Seems kind of dumb. So why would you obligate something inside your zoning that doesn't meet the smell test of the reality of your own information?
We were out, Justin, my neighbor and colleague, Joe, him and I went for a long walk this last weekend just to get out. And we were walking through some of the neighborhoods here in town. And it was fascinating because we got into a part where there were a bunch of 1920s, 1930s, what you would just call starter homes, the small little, maybe 600 square foot little houses. And I pointed out, and we talked about this because we were both on the planning commission the last 3 years. In our zoning code, that's classified as a tiny home. And a tiny home needs to meet the requirements of a house and then meet like these 18 subpart requirements. And, you got to notify your neighbors and go grovel in front of different people to get this approved. And what we were really looking at through this whole neighborhood were these starter homes, these things that humans have built for thousands of years. And of course, then you'd see 2 of these, and then the third one would have a second story and an addition on the back. But if you look closely, it was the same house. It was just a little bit more mature in its process. We've done so much. I said once here in Brainerd, and I got roundly criticized for it. I said we would be better off with no zoning code than with the one we have now. And if I were in charge, I would say in 6 months, it's gone. You've got 6 months to get something new that is acceptable. But in 6 months, this thing is going to sunset because it is doing more damage to us than good. And that's not an anti-government thing. And that's not an anti-zone. I mean, I don't think we should have anarchy and chaos. I do think that you need some regulatory control. But I do think we have to ask a serious question about how much damage our current codes are doing to us, and whether that damage is, can be justified, particularly at a time when we need so much investment.
And before we get done beating the zoning horse, I'm just going to confess I was a zoning administrator for 5 years. I
ran a whole company that did it for a decade, right?
Yeah. So we understand the need for zoning, but we also are challenging those that administer the zoning code to think differently about it, and to just take a step back off your ego to see how this fits within your community and ask questions. And sometimes, I think it was Robert Frost that says, you don't take down a fence until you know why it was put up. So we at least have to be asking the questions about, why is that fence there? Why is that rule there? Is it really necessary? And just go through it with like a loofah and kind of like scrub off some of the stuff that's not needed. And that should be, that, it helps your community in the long run.
I was the interim zoning administrator. I agreed to fill in for 6 months for Benton County, Minnesota. So one of the most rural counties in the state. They had some zones with minimum lot sizes that were 80 acres and 120 acres. So, I mean, this is large land. They needed someone to fill in. I did for 6 months. We had a variance request. The person was putting a porch on the side of their house, and the side yard setback was 50 feet, and they were encroaching to like 47 feet or something like that. So a porch on the side of a house, a 50-foot setback. They needed a variance. I'm not joking. When we went through the variance criteria, one of the variance criteria was, will it create, will it impede the ability of light to shine on adjacent properties, sunlight, and will it impede the flow of air? Joe, where does the standard for light shining on adjacent buildings and the flow of air, where does that come from?
It's like New York City or something like that.
Frickin' Manhattan. Yeah. Like, why do we have a code in the most rural of counties that literally are the standards for skyscrapers in Manhattan to make sure that, when you put up a building, it didn't block all the light and restrict airflow? It's because we've done a lot of mindless things. We copied a copy. And all of a sudden, one of the most rural counties in Minnesota is asking us for a porch addition on the side of a house to look at air circulation and whether it's blocking light on adjacent properties.
Come on.
This is what when we have that kind of absurdity in our codes, we're not doing a service to anybody at all.
What are you, some sort of crazy person? Shouldn't you set up some sort of wind tests out there with good little things measuring the wind, and then build a little mock porch addition to see if it changes the wind flow? I mean, seriously, study this stuff.
Crazy. I took great delight in actually telling them why they had this standard, because they would sit there with all earnestness in their meetings, these volunteer board of adjustment people, and they would say, well, does it do that? And I'm like, okay, you know where this comes from, right? No, where? And I told them, and they were embarrassed. They were like, oh my gosh, what are we doing? And I do think a lot of this is, Joe, I think you rightly point out what a very prudent approach is, which is don't tear the fence down until you know why it was built. I mean, that's actually a very conservative kind of way of thinking about things. It's like, there's a reason why we do things. With zoning, once you realize that it really is part of this new experiment that we've undertaken, it's intrinsic with this, how do we replicate this pattern of development over and over and over? It's more akin to just the assembly line of America, as opposed to some like organic process that came up that resulted in a fence here. And to me, the first time I heard Andres Duany speak about zoning, it was like he was challenging my religion, you know. It's like this was probably 2004, 2005, and I'm running my own firm and I'm doing zoning work, and I'm trying to make it work. Like I'm trying to take ordinances that I know are broken and fix them and make them work. And then I heard him talk about it and I'm like, oh my gosh, I've got like a false God here that I'm, you know, like it was just, and you know, ever since then I have kind of joined him in a crusade to say, we need some serious reform in this area.
And as we leave with Andreas, one of my favorite quotes of his is that codes spread like oil slicks. I love that. It's just like, we'll just steal things from other places and not even think through. Yes. We're just trying to solve a problem administratively. Somebody put up a concertina wire fence in the middle of downtown. So now I need an ordinance that says no concertina wires downtown because it's kind of dangerous, you know?
So who has an ordinance on concertina wire? And guess what? The DMV or the DMZ has one. Let's grab theirs and put it in. Yeah, no, just in the last 3 years when I was on the Plan Commission, I can't tell you how many times we would get some problem or issue, and then people would say, "Well, go find ordinances from other cities, and we can copy them." And you'd be like, "Oh, what are we doing? What are we doing?" So sorry, Joe and I could go on and on zoning for a long time.
That was good. That was good. Thank y'all. Folk joining us live. We have about, let's see, just under 20 minutes left. If you are sitting on a question, now's the time to ask. Again, click that Q&A button, and we
Jacob,
will try our best to.
I want to try to package a few of these questions together.
Sure. Do you see some of the document you want to knock out?
Yeah, there's public housing, colleges, state capitals, all of that stuff.
Please lead the way.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, you have to start by measuring it. What's the amount of non-taxable stuff inside your community? And compare against a peer group. If you're St. Paul, compare yourself against Raleigh or something. You know, just find a peer group to see what's their content of non-taxable land. What we try to suggest to once you go do that measurement is pay attention to what you're taking off the tax rolls. So, and a lot of times those buildings are downtown, which is your most fertile soil. That's the stuff that's producing all of that wealth. And when you take that land off the tax rolls for non-taxable, you've eliminated that ability. But on the flip side, if it is something like a state capitol or a city hall or a county office, you're bringing jobs into the downtown. Those folks eat, shop, drink, whatever. They have that other activity. If you have a courthouse, it brings in attorneys. There's all of that stuff. But you have to make sure that it works together. One of the things that you see time and time again, and anybody that's been to a state capitol, is it's almost like a UFO dropped those buildings in. It's like there's somehow those people don't need to get food or something like that. You see this in Raleigh. It's like you have to basically take a hike through like a football field of parking to be able to get to your first cheeseburger or something like that. That's not a sound investment to cohabitate with the private sector when you start to alienate yourself from it. As far as public housing goes, that's a community need that's based in every community based on the needs of producing in your community. And let's all realize that the private sector isn't going to build the poorhouse all by itself. They're not going to build the affordable product, particularly in hot markets. The private sector is going to go after the biggest dollar that they can get their return on. So in a community like Asheville, we have an affordable housing issue because, well, up until what we're currently in, we had a situation of a paucity of supply and a lot of demand coming in. So that distorted our prices. And if you go to California, it's distorted through Prop 13 and other artificial economic governors that they put on themselves. And then on top of that, they make it really difficult to build new housing because they fight it all the time with the NIMBY stuff. So if your community has a need for affordable housing, that's the poor are with us, and we have to provide for those that have the least amount of access to our community to be part of our community. And that's just a general community need that needs to happen in places. So I'm not advocating for getting rid of public housing. I'm not advocating for getting rid of parks or city hall or whatever. It's just making sure you measure it. And actually in Minnesota, and maybe I'll do this in the next session, I'll show the measurement of parks and non-taxable real estate and how you can do it as a valuation growth in your community.
I think it's one of the most brilliant things that you've done is to show that, because, really at the end of the day, we need City Hall. We need county government buildings. We're going to have these things. And if you look back at the way that our ancestors around the world for thousands of years built these things, built them, yes, to function, for that civic function, but they also built them as, wealth radiating machines. When you build a nice county courthouse or a nice city hall, and it's got, in my poor town back in the 1930s, they built one with marble columns and beautiful front windows and a dome on top and marble staircase inside. These were like ridiculously poor people in the middle of nowhere built this thing because it made they had to have the building, and it made everything around it wealthy. We look now today, and all those lawyers and county officials and everybody who comes to town are surrounded by a big parking lot. The building looks like, a penitentiary. And we lose not only the value of the site, it doesn't radiate wealth, it kind of sucks wealth. It's this vacant kind of dead place in the downtown, but all the people who are there, they're not walking down to the grocery, to the coffee shop. They're not walking down to the restaurant. They're not part of the day-to-day activity of the community because it's a massive parking lot. They get in the car and they drive out to the strip out on the edge of town. So we've actually configured something that is not adding a tax value. We've actually configured it in a way where it doesn't add any other value either. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the thing that a really smart city does, is take something that would not add tax value and make sure that it adds other value. Mm-hmm. And Joe, if you would show that one from Hennepin County next week, I think people will see that very clearly. Okay. Because, you've got some investments there where the value just radiates out in ways that are astounding when you do it right.
Yeah. And also I'm sorry, Jacob, I'm going to grab Jason's comment here.
No, you're good, please.
He asked a question about Kenneth Brown's 10-point budget process is a municipal tool. That's at the Government Finance Officers Organization, the GFOA. And there's a couple other questions in here about the municipal finance side of things. I just opened up the document on the left on my other screen. The couple of things that all the indicators that are in that document are a good place to start. What's missing is the land component. Just doing things on a per capita basis is good for, let's say, the police department or fire department, because that's a service you're providing to individuals. When you get into the cost to service, when you bring in the debt load of the streets and pipes and everything else like that, that's geospatial. That's all based on how much land you're consuming. That means that road's got to be really long, right? So I would say I would just take these 10 points to the next level, which is which ones are geospatial and which ones aren't. We get a lot of requests from folks that are just like, well, you're not measuring the police department or the fire department. And we typically don't. And the reason is because that gets political real fast. Are you going to say that certain neighborhoods should have police services and certain neighborhoods shouldn't? And then secondly, when you bring in the debt load or the replacement cost of these roads and pipes, it dwarfs every police department and fire department right away. But we don't see that because we always when I say we, communities usually just look at the budget expenditures and they just see that pie chart and they see how much is going to the police department, and it's usually like 30% of your money goes to the police department. That seems high, and it is. But you're not seeing any of the debt load of what those roads are. That's not in your expense ledger because basically we're not maintaining our infrastructure properly. So if it's not in the budget, you don't see it, but you eventually do when that road comes calling to be
right.
When you start doing road projects.
There's also something that Raleigh is asking that in the Q&A thing here that's very similar. Asking a question about, those costs that kind of ramp up in a plateau. So you have a community, you've got a fire truck, you add 40 more houses, you don't need to buy another fire truck. You've got it covered. We see this in the engineering world with like a water tower. So you put in a water tower and you can serve a big area. And just because you're adding new homes, it doesn't mean that you have to add a new water tower every time. You've got one big kind of fixed cost. The problem with these, and this goes for police protection, it goes for all the fire protection, fire equipment, it goes for things like lift stations and water treatment facilities and these big ticket items, is that what you have is they go up in plateaus. So you'll have, you don't need a water tower, you don't need a water tower, now you do. Then, you need them for a while, then you do. And they're massive expenditures. What we don't do and what we really need to do, we tend to focus on, here's the big cost. And so how do we get a bunch more users in to pay for that cost? And what we really need to be saying is, as we're building up to that big ticket bump we've got to do, as we're giving out more and more like hookup fees or more people getting connected to the system, how good of a utilization are we making of our current capacity? Are we growing enough tax base and wealth to actually cover that jump? Or are we just trying to fill space because we have a fixed cost? Oftentimes we have this thing we look at as a sunk cost, and we're not really cognizant of the long-term associated costs that go with it. And so we just hook people up because any hookup is going to help us. And it's really an unhelpful way to look at it. If we look at Lafayette too, when you step back, we took a lot of those police and fire things when we were doing that analysis, and we made them into something that I was calling like our overhead costs. Here's just our cost of doing business. And the incredible thing is that when you get a system that's really big, those fire trucks, the water towers, they're big ticket items individually, but they kind of get smoothed out in the size of the system. And so, you really lose that push of the next increment that you see in smaller and mid-sized communities. When you get into a bigger place, it becomes more of a systems issue. And the fact that you're connecting people up that need 20 different pumps to get their sewage to the treatment facility becomes a bigger issue than, we got to add one more pump and what's the cost of that?
Chuck and Joe, I'm curious how this looks for, let's see how you phrase this, communities with no city council. So they call it a special district. Anthony asks, how do these strategies relate to communities with no city council, but instead a multi-purpose special district that is required to provide city functions but has no land use authority? So how do all these strategies that you shared relate to a place that doesn't actually have authority over the way they're using their land?
Somebody's got authority. I mean, that would be probably the county at that level. I think I saw that question earlier, and part of this is, counties are basically fixed. Counties don't annex other counties. They're the land area that's out there. And they just, when we set up our country, we just made a bunch of areas with counties, and just there's a sheriff that kind of handles that area. That's it. Well, eventually people move out there and start settling, and they start having to work with each other. And there comes a point where you create a hamlet or a village or a town based on how many people are out there, that you have to work together. To do things just based off of, oh, we're just going to have a district that just pays for fire, or a district that pays for this. You're essentially building a community just at a la carte basis. Eventually you're going to be somewhere. You're going to be something, right? So as that area starts to fill in and settle, it might be time to incorporate. It might be time to say, these are the minimum needs that we have now. We can't just do a pay as we go because it's not working. And all of these principles apply, even if you don't do that, even if you don't incorporate. Let's say it's like politically untenable, like that's sacrilege in the community to actually make a government. We don't want a government. We're doing fine paying as we go. Well, are you really? Are you really measuring this stuff? Are you making sure that the fee system that people pay in for the water district or the fire district, that's all taxes, basically. It's just called fee instead. Mm-hmm. That's still a payment for that service. Is it efficient? Is it productive? And is it keeping you above water? Pardon the pun. These are all systems just by a different name.
It's funny because we see sometimes where cities will privatize their sewer system or their water system. So they'll go in the opposite direction, where they'll have a public utility and they'll sell it to someone to operate. And one of the first things that happens is rates double or triple. And people start to scream, oh, it's the private company. They're just trying to make a big profit off of us. This is the cost of privatization. And like, I get that. I understand that. But the reality is that the city itself was not charging you the rates that it needed to maintain the system. And so what we often see in these special districts is that they will limp along and limp. Some of them are very well run. And some of them do charge the fees and have sinking funds and do things that cities can't do to actually run the system really well. But a lot of them will limp along and limp along and limp along, and then go and turn for bailout and say, we need to join this city because our system's gone bad and we need you to help us. We need someone to come in and fix this for us. I think that if I were looking at municipal financing in terms of fragility, it's the, go all through Texas and look at the municipal, the utility districts. And these are to me, the places that are going to show up the soonest on the bankruptcy rolls, in terms of not being able to meet their obligations, and not being able to collect enough money to pay off their debts.
And by the way, with the bonds and all of that stuff that Chuck talked about earlier, typically in those contracts is a requirement that they get first right of refusal on all your money that comes in. So they're going to
over your pensions and over everything else.
Or you can't hire the next police officer, or you can't pay to fix that park. And that's when we typically see a lot of our systems break down inside our municipalities or our governments of any kind, or even the fire districts and stuff like that. When you start to see a decline in the quality of service or the commitment to service, it's because you have to pay that bond off. You're obligated financially or legally to do that.
Don't have a choice. Mm-hmm.
Okay, as we wrap up, I have a great question here submitted live that I think will top things off really well. Joe, of course, as we watch your presentations, learn more about these value per acre analyses, consider the cost that it actually costs to provide all this public infrastructure. Of course, we want that main takeaway to be, let's change the way we're building. Let's identify the places that are most productive and show them a lot of love. We got a question here from someone who checked out your presentation and is in the midst of working on their 10-year comprehensive planning process. This person asks, if we identified the most productive properties within our community, how do you plan based upon that information? So after they see this presentation, this great message that you have, what are some next steps as someone's putting together this comprehensive plan?
Well, part of this is there's some basic numbers that I advocate in every presentation in all of our studies, and whenever I talk to anybody is what's your city worth? And it's actually a really simple question to answer. That's if you have access to your assessor's data roll, or just call up your assessor and ask and just say, what's the sum total of taxable value of my community? Starting with that number gives you a really good idea of what you have as a value. So Asheville, my hometown here, is $14 billion with a B. That's a really, really big number. So are we maintaining that asset? Are we interrogating it properly? If you were off in Wall Street, do you think a $14 billion company wouldn't be looking where their money's coming from and where it's going? Of course they would. So I have every expectation that my community should be doing the same thing. Even if you were a small town worth a couple $100 million, that's still a lot of money, right? So as part of the comp plan process, it's completely legitimate to say, this is the stuff that's producing wealth and we need to keep on reinvesting in this. We can't just kill the golden goose and eat pate because we've killed the golden goose. So here's Asheville now. I'm going to beat up Asheville here for a second. My downtown's now worth $1 billion. $1 billion just for the downtown and a $14 billion asset. That's pretty good for our downtown. We just went through a whole bonding program and our community voted on $70 million of bonds. Only $2 million go to the downtown. So it's worth $1 billion and it gets $2 million to help fix it. How is that asset going to keep its value? You can't fix a sidewalk with that. So if you're not properly investing, I'm not saying put all the money back into the golden goose, but we have to realize when you see one of our models and you see how awesome the downtowns are and how much it flattens out, it's because that first generation of wealth that we built past World War II the downtowns were much bigger, and we drained them down to spread all that value out. And that's what we did. We basically sucked our golden geese dry and then walked away from them, even worse, which was unbelievably stupid in the 70s. But it's because we weren't paying attention to where we built all of that wealth from. So we wouldn't be able to afford our suburban worlds had it not been for having good urbanism before World War II. And we see this with a lot of cities. Those that actually grew at the right time, they actually have assets around, like Asheville. We have assets that we could bring back to life. Or, Brainerd. You have a few of them.
Absolutely.
Y'all are somehow taking like a hatchet to your own shins and knocking some of them down, but it's just like you still have them there.
Right.
So that's wealth that could come back if you invest in it properly. Or like what's behind me here, and these buildings that have been around for 2,000 years producing wealth like this. So it's just. But they need cultivation. They still need investment. They still need a sidewalk fix. They still need to repair, thicken up, fill in the building gaps between them. You have to pay attention to the golden geese as part of the process, but you need to know where the geese are and measure that.
Let me give a quick answer to what I would do in a comp plan, because I think there's 4 things that come out, and they're actually pretty simple. The first one is you identify the stuff that's not working and you stop doing that. Like, just stop building the stuff that's bankrupting you. The second is you identify the stuff that is working and you say, how do we make more of this? Like, we have a model here that works. How do we create more of this model? The third thing then is you find the places that are not working and you ask, how do we make them more like the places that are? What are the policies and the steps we need to put in place so that these areas start to become more like these other areas that are working? How do we pick them up? How do we get more out of them? And then the fourth, and I think this is the most urgent, but also kind of the most difficult for us to get our minds around, is that if we have more, let's just take roads that we can maintain, why would we continue on with a process of first in, first out? The one that's in the worst condition we'll maintain now and we'll let the rest. What we need to do is triage based on our high productivity areas. And so if we have, in Joe's example, the golden goose, we should never allow that area that's actually producing wealth and creating value for us. We should never let that area decline. Our first maintenance dollar should go to making sure those sidewalks are fixed, those potholes are filled, those lights bulbs are replaced. That place is kept well, because that's the only place that's keeping this thing afloat. If we say, no, we can put that off for a few years because this cul-de-sac out here, we've been delaying for 10 years, and this little collector road over here, we've got the mayor's out there, we got to make sure that's done. What you're doing is you're taking your limited resources and you're squandering them. I would use the value per acre in a comprehensive plan to create a triage list of, here's our high priority maintenance area, here's our next priority maintenance area, and then here's our lower priority maintenance area. And I would spend my capital dollars that way.
Joe, Chuck, thank you. That was fantastic. We're at the top of the hour. Thank you guys for sharing your wisdom and experiences with us. Really informative webinar that I'm sure everyone got a lot of good stuff out of as well. If we did not get to your question, I see about 6 in here. We do not want this to be the end of this conversation. If you go over to the community site at community.strongtowns.org, we really encourage you to share your questions there. The staff is kicking it there. You'll find hundreds of fellow Strong Towns advocates hanging out there. Share your questions there, and let's have some ongoing dialogue about how we can address any particular ideas or struggles that you might be facing within your own community. Again, Joe's webinar that he shared this past Tuesday, we're putting that on the community site as well this afternoon. So keep an eye on that. And if you want to refer back to any of the great conversations we had today, we'll also get this AMA up on the site as well tomorrow afternoon. Joe, Chuck, again, thank you. This is going to be a lot of fun. Joe, we're going to see you again in a few weeks. Is that correct? You got another presentation coming up?
A week from Tuesday, we get the
Beautiful.
Joe Show Part 2. Yeah, I can't wait.
That's right. We got Joe Show Part 2, and then Chuck next Tuesday, sharing Confessions of a Traffic Engineer presentation. Another
That's
one
right.
that you do not want to miss. Joe, Chuck, thank you. Everyone who joined us live, thank you as well. If we didn't hit your question, let us talk it out in the community sites, and we will pick this up again next week.
Take care. Thanks, Joe.
All right, Al, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Talk soon.
Take care.
Bye-bye.